Welcome, everyone, to our seminar on spirituality, theology, and health here at Duke University. Today we have Jill Hamilton presenting on the topic of using spirituality to cope with COVID-19, the experiences of African-American breast cancer survivors. So Jill Hamilton is a friend of mine for many years, and she is an extraordinary person. She's a nurse, registered nurse, PhD in nursing. She's been at Johns Hopkins as a nurse, as an associate professor, and currently she's an associate professor and senior faculty fellow at the School of Nursing at Emory University. And she has done a lot of work in the area of African Americans' experiences with regard to coping with various illnesses in terms of prayer, in terms of scripture, in terms of songs. So she has a tremendous background in this area. And I'm going to not delay here and instead just turn it over to Jill. So Jill, take it away.
Thank you, Harold. So good afternoon, everybody. I want to just get started by putting this study in some kind of context for everyone. So like Harold said, I have previously done quite a bit of research on how religious practices such as prayers, Bible verses, and singing hymns, religious songs have been used in response to stressful life events, life-threatening illnesses. And this study, I conducted interviews very early in the pandemic in May of 2020. And I wanted to just kind of reach out and interview some folk who were at risk for serious illness and death to find out how they were coping, what they were using, and how this pandemic was affecting them. So the interviews were conducted very early during COVID, at a time when, if you recall, churches had just started closing their doors, access to healthcare was limited, and people were extremely fearful during that time. Now, let me just say this, I only have 17 slides, so there's a lot of time for questions and comments during this or even after. So next slide. Now, the information on this slide, background information on African Americans and cancer, African Americans with breast cancer, is not new. And you guys probably are very familiar with everything that was going on with the news at that time to point out those individuals who were at most risk for serious illness and death during COVID, particularly among those were African American with breast cancer because of their immunocompromised condition, and also because of the prevalence of comorbid conditions among African American breast cancer patients. Next slide. So additional background, African American women with breast cancer have the second highest incidence rates of breast cancer, the highest mortality rates, and they were among those at higher risk of contracting and dying from COVID. Next slide. Additional background, African Americans generally rely on their spirituality and participation in religious activities to cope with stressful life events and illness. And church attendance during this time was limited. And so they were restricted from attending churches where they generally got used a lot of their coping strategies, or were able to engage in conversation and fellowship with others for support during this time. Next slide. So the purpose of this study This was an exploration of the use of spirituality during COVID. And I also wanted to know the benefits derived from this coping strategy, from spirituality during this pandemic. Next slide. So for the methods, I used a basic qualitative descriptive design. I just wanted to ask the question, what are you using? How is it a benefit to you? Just in general, what's going on? I use purposive sampling. Now, purposive sampling and qualitative methods, we want to particularly identify those individuals who actually can give us information-rich data. So I wanted to interview breast cancer patients because of their higher risk for serious illness and death. But I also wanted to reach out to, and I did not use this as an inclusion-exclusion criteria, their church affiliation. So I really went after women with breast cancer, but I also started out recruiting through a breast cancer support group. And then I used open-ended, semi-structured interviews. I used qualitative content analysis. Descriptive analysis was used to describe the demographics of the population. Next slide. So in the end, I interviewed a total of 18 African-American women diagnosed with, they were breast cancer survivors. Average age was 58. Range of age was 47 to 75. Most of these women were diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, followed by stage 1. The overwhelming majority of them were single, divorced, widowed. Nearly half of the sample were college educated, so they were a well-educated group of women. Many of them were employed full-time, the majority of them employed full-time. And the overwhelming majority of them lived in rural areas. When I looked at whether or not they lived alone or lived with other family members, they were split 50-50. And also, let me add to this, 40% or less had been diagnosed they were less than 5 years from their date of diagnosis for breast cancer. Next slide. So 4 themes emerged from the data, from the narratives with the qualitative content analysis. The 4 themes were, number 1, increased engagement in non-church religious activities. The second one, reliance on God when fearful. And the third, finding joy and courage through hymns and scripture. And the last, number 4, finding meaning through spirituality. So in the next few slides, next slide, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about these things, and I have some exemplar quotes. But given that I have so few slides, I'll be able to also, I want to also kind of reflect on these quotes and kind of give my thinking about maybe what was going on then and why I found the findings that I did. So the first one, of course, increased engagement in non-church religious activities. So remember, this was at a time when church doors were closed. And so these women sought out ways to engage in religious practices outside of church. So this first quote is from a 59-year-old breast cancer survivor. She's a 7-year survivor. And she says, prayer is more prevalent in my life now because of COVID than it had been before. She says, I think I just find myself just thanking the Lord throughout the day, just for being able to have a job. Because remember at that time too, people were losing their jobs and they weren't able to have incomes to pay their bills. So she says, I'm praying now more than I ever did. And then she says, even though I'm working remotely, she says, downstairs, I have posted on my desk. She says, I have scriptures all around her computer just to remind her that God is there for her. And she says, I listen to gospel music most of the time during the day. And she says, and I have my devotion every morning. So I can just imagine she probably had post-it notes all around her computer where she's working with scriptures all around. Next slide. This is another quote from a 61-year-old early stage breast cancer survivor. She's a 4-year survivor. And she says, we actually do a lot over the phone, but I've been watching I'm on Facebook, so I have friends that are ministers, so I've been watching their Facebook Live. So like I told my friend yesterday, I've been in church all day because everybody comes on at different times. So she's able to go from one service to the next to the next. And it's almost like this COVID pandemic created more opportunities for individuals to engage in religious services, and even more than their own church, because they could just go to church as often as they wanted to because different services came on. And also, I know this has been my experience, that I'm also able to, even if I miss a service, I can go back because the service is recorded. Or even if I wanted to listen to a sermon again, I can go back and do that. So I can imagine that this was the same kind of experience for some of these women.
Sorry, something about headline. It's okay.
Anybody have a question? Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next category is reliance on God when fearful, feeling isolated. And this is a quote from a 72-year-old. She's 72 years old. She is a 19-year breast cancer survivor. And she really talks about this whole notion about fear during COVID. And she says, I just had a moment to where it's almost like fear tried to grip my heart, but I had to go inside and rely on what I knew to be true concerning the word of God. God is able to comfort you. He can protect you. And she says, and if you are a believer in him, he will protect you. He will comfort you. And she said, that's my protection right now. That's the whole of who I am as a child of God. And when I reflect back on this quote, two things come to mind. Number one is this whole fear. And she says, fear tried to grip my heart. It was like it tried to, but it didn't, because I remembered the protection of God. So it tried to grip me. The other thing that comes out to me is this whole notion around who I am as a child of God. If I am a child of God and I am a believer in God, then I am protected by God. And therefore, I don't need to fear, although these women had to constantly go to scriptures and constantly remind themselves that I am a child of God, therefore I am protected from this whole COVID situation. Next slide. So this is the third category, finding joy and courage from listening to gospel music and scripture. The quote on this slide comes from a 50-year-old, 8-year survivor, and she had stage 1 breast cancer. And she says, my main and probably only Bible verse that I read constantly and still to this day is 2 Timothy 1:7, that God has not given you the spirit of fear, And she says, and that's how I got through these fearful, fearful times where I just knew over and over again. And so what she's referring to here is that those fearful, fearful times, if you recall, back during this time, during the early stages of the pandemic, and the constant news was reflecting the people that were dying and images of all the dead bodies. And that was a very fearful time for these women, because they knew that, or they felt like during this time, there was no cure for COVID. If you got it, then you just would probably die from it. Whereas with the breast cancer, it wasn't that stressful because there was medication, there was treatment for the breast cancer. So COVID was particularly stressful and fearful for these women, just because of the constant negative news that was coming on television, social media. That's all they could see was the dead bodies and the death from this pandemic. And then she goes on to say, for God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and of sound mind. And that's the thing that she held on to when she was scared, when she was worried, when she was a little anxious. Now, if I could go back and repeat some of this study, I would try to interview some of the more older survivors, because it's been my experience that the older survivors won't readily admit to fear and worry as much as younger. That's a hypothesis that I have. But if I ever get a chance to repeat this, that's what I'll do. Next slide. Okay, so another finding joy and courage from listening to gospel music and from scripture. So this quote is from a 48-year-old, and she's an 8-year survivor of breast cancer, stage 2. And she says, but I know that what I relied on as far as faith and prayer was Isaiah 4, verse 10. And that for her was the verse that got her through. And that verse says, fear not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I will strengthen thee. So Isaiah 4, verse 10. And she says also, I was listening to this song that my sister sings. It's called Faith Is, because the song says, faith is my hope in you. Faith is my trust in you. And it also says, I'm an overcomer. And that's how I see myself, as an overcomer. I'm more than a conqueror. I am an overcomer. And so whenever I feel a little down, I'll go to that song, and then I'll go to that scripture. Next slide. So then the last category, finding meaning through spirituality. So this quote comes from a 62-year-old, stage 2, and she was a 2-year survivor. So she was still relatively close to her initial diagnosis with breast cancer. And she says, God gave us this time to do self-reflection, to look inside ourselves and see if we know where we're at, And coming out of this, what are we supposed to be doing differently? How can we do things better? How can we make our lives better? And this is very similar to how cancer patients, in my other research, this is very similar to how African-American cancer survivors in general have thought about finding meaning and purpose through the experience. So how can I use this to better myself? How can I use this to help others? Finding meaning through spirituality, okay? And then next slide. And this is a quote from a 49-year-old 2-year survivor, stage 2. And she says, I think biblical, you're bringing up the plagues, thinking back in that time, thinking about Noah and the ark. And for her, she was expressing her thinking around, these things have, historically, we have faced plagues and other natural disasters. She says, and she was also saying to me that we needed to be obedient during this time. So when the CDC came out with recommendations to stay in, the mask, social distance, that to her was being obedient. And long as she was obedient, then she would come out okay. And she's talking about Noah and the ark, and when the flood came and he and his family had to go in and stay until it was time to come out. So relating to that. So she was able to relate the rules for today, the social distancing, and those kinds of things, the recommendations from CDC to be safe, to how people had to be obedient during biblical times to be safe, to come through this situation. Next slide. So in conclusion, for these women, they adapted their religious practices. So they weren't able to go to church, but they still sought out church through other means. They found themselves engaging in prayer more. They used songs, they used Bible verses, but it was particularly interesting how they turned to social media, Facebook, and found additional church services. So for them, church services were more accessible than not. Now, the question is for future thinking. So we know that probably 38% of folk in these remote rural areas, they don't have computers and they don't have smartphones. So what did they do? How did they adapt? How did they find services? And then secondly, these women were able to recall biblical texts as reminders that this too shall pass. They recalled the great flood from before and other situations in the Bible where people had to be obedient and wait for that time to pass. And then spirituality was related to a self-reflection. So God is, I don't want to say allowing us to go through this time, or this COVID pandemic served a purpose. And what was that purpose? Maybe the purpose could have been to make us think about our lives, to change our ways, to somehow be a better person coming out of this. So how can this situation improve who I am, and how can I do better? And that is all I have. Are there any questions or comments?
Jill does a workshop right following our 5-day workshop on qualitative methods. So she is a real expert on this topic. So any questions related to the qualitative methodology that she may have used would be welcome, or anything at all about what she's presented today.
Yeah, I actually have a question. I'm new to the group, but thank you for sharing. I really enjoyed the presentation. The question I have is in some religious categories. One thing that I ran into anecdotally was people utilizing that second theme that you mentioned in the African American women, the kind of fear, responding to this stressful situation, and saying they're going to trust in God and not have fear. And in other groups, I've found that response led to kind of a disregard for coronavirus, you know, whether that was early in the pandemic, a refusal to wear masks or a refusal to socially distance, or later in the pandemic, when the vaccination came out, a refusal to take the vaccination, a refusal to take other measures. Within this population that you were studying, did you find that, you know, I'm not going to have fear, I'm not going to live in fear type mentality? Did it lead to behaviors that put any of these women at higher risk for being affected by the pandemic in negative ways in regards to their health? And I'll go on mute because you guys can probably hear the interstate in the background.
So I know exactly what you're talking about, but I will say these were mostly older women, and they got the vaccine as soon as it was available. They social distance, and they really tried to adhere. And they also struggled with, like, the women that did not live alone or lived in a household with other people who may have been essential workers. That was a real struggle for them, but they really tried their best to adhere to the CDC recommendations. Now, Matthew, the question is, for those individuals, and I have encountered that when I do venture out to the grocery store, you see the chin mask, and you know, you ask people about the vaccine and they get really defensive, and I'm not going to do it. And I've even got family members who won't get the vaccine, right? So the question is, for these women, they were very, they were believers, they were strong believers, right? And the question is I wonder if that same belief, that same faith in God, that same reverence for God exists among people who refuse to get the vaccine, people who refuse to social distance. I don't know. That's a question that I have. But among people who are strong believers, they are very adherent to the recommendations, particularly I do a lot of research in rural areas with women in rural areas. And I thought one time that I would engage in research to help promote the vaccine. And when I called clergy in those areas, they said, not a problem in this area. All the older people in this area got the vaccine. So that would not be something that's relevant. So anybody else have any thoughts about that? Yes, Barbara. You
Unmute
muted.
yourself.
Hi.
There you go.
Hi. I have a different thought. I'm thinking that because women, because of, I'm thinking that some of them might have a real advantage over us white folks, because if they're able to access services online or gospel music or whatever, they seem to be much more likely to embody the experience, and which I think is a very strong way of fortifying one's spirituality. I mean, if one can get up and move around and dance and all, I think that's can be very important. And I think a lot of us white folks just kind of sit still and don't move.
That's interesting. I think, though, that it's the messages that are communicated through religious songs and through Bible verses that really help these women to cope with the situation. So, but thank you, Barbara. That was interesting. Anybody else? Yes.
Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Robert Rogers. I want to kind of pick up on Matthew, but then I have another question or another point to make. So in terms of reliance on God when feeling isolated, I guess what came to my mind when Matthew was speaking was this whole issue of spiritual bypass. That is to say, they're feeling isolated and they rely on God to address their isolation and to feel comforted. But do they also reach out to other people to or engage in behaviors or take responsibility for dealing with their isolation versus solely depending on God? So that struck me when Matthew brought this topic up.
So, I think that, and I'm going to just say what I think based on my research with over the years. I think that people who reach out to God are more than likely going to also reach out to other people, because it's the experience with God that makes us love people and love people that are around us and reach out that way. However, Robert, we are older African Americans. We have been socialized to be strong. We have been socialized to not complain, to not express worry, to not express fear. So while we may engage or reach out to people for support, there's a limit to that. And there are times when, particularly you hear old folks say, there are times when I can only take it to God. Or late in the midnight hour, I got to go to God because I can't go to somebody else because I got to be strong. Now, they will reach out to people who are trusted people who they know I can express my fear, my sorrow, my grief, and it won't go anyplace else. And people are fortunate if they have that one person, but not everybody has that one person. So then they take it to God. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it did provide a perspective, but I guess I would also say from my experience as a pastor, that I would think that older members tend to rely on God more than reaching out to people.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
especially if they don't have the technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree. And they say that, I once had an interview with an 85-year-old and she said, I can go to God. She said, because you can't trust man, because man will fail you. Right.
Right.
And that's the way, that's how they were socialized to deal with stress. You go to God, you don't go to your fellow man.
Right.
Because your fellow man can't do nothing, but God's going to be there. He's always going to be there. He's never going to let you down. You remember that song, Robert, call him up, tell him what you want. Jesus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to go to theme number one, the increased engagement in non-church religious activities. And I'm going back here because what came to mind is your definition of spiritual versus religious. So I would argue that prayer and scriptures and gospel music are spiritual activities and not necessarily religious. They could be, but in this context, I would describe them more as spiritual. And then the watching of services then I would classify as a religious activity, if that makes sense.
It does. But Robert, you know what else I'm going to say to you? For that old generation, they didn't distinguish between religion. Spirituality wasn't in their their vocabulary. It's all my religion. Remember, my religion, my religion, my religion. And only until you start interviewing younger, my generation younger, more educated populations, African Americans, I think then we started trying to make the distinction between spirituality and religion. So for me, I see songs, they're religious practices, but they're expressions of spirituality.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
for me, it's difficult to tease the two out, although in academia and other settings, we need to, separate them. Yes.
Right. And I would surmise that the participants in your study would describe themselves as both spiritual and religious at the same time. You know?
I think the younger, my generation and younger would say they would use the language spiritual more than they would religion, because religion for them is associated with this dogma, this autocratic
Mhm,
that people don't want to be associated with
mhm.
currently. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments.
Hi, this is Alice, and I just have a question as well along those same lines of spirituality and religion. And I was just wondering, and I don't know how many younger, what the number of younger population was, but I'm wondering if there was a clear distinction in describing religion as a relationship, as opposed to a relationship with God, as opposed to spiritual activity. So was there an distinction between how persons related to the experience of religion in the context of a relationship with God?
Okay, so in my research over the years, I have intentionally wanted to learn more about what goes on Monday through Saturday and not just doing church on Sunday, right? So I'm gonna say, I would say that just in general, these women and even other women, African Americans that I have interviewed, they would say my relationship with God is separate from what happens when I go sit in church on Sunday. So my relationship with God is not necessarily religion, it would be more spirituality. My relationship with God, my relationship with others, my expressions, people, during the weekday, read the Bible and make meaning out of a situation through Bible verses and songs. So those are expressions of their religious practices, like I said before, but they're expressions of spirituality, right? And then finding meaning through spirituality. That's all spirituality. That's not necessarily what goes on in church on Sunday, what goes on religious doctrine, if that makes sense. Because Robert, I'm gonna come back to you. So would you say that for African Americans, even though if you are clergy and you preach something from the pulpit, that doesn't mean that that's the same meaning that's attached to a song or a Bible verse. It's just that you may be preaching one thing from the pulpit, but people come to their own interpretation of songs and Bible verses. That's what
Yes.
I've learned over the years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. People, attach or interpret their own meaning to sermons, scriptures, and songs. I also feel that the Holy Spirit will provide an interpretation that's relevant to a person's life. Now, I do want to. I thought I heard you say that Sunday service is focus on dogma, et cetera, et cetera. I would
Not entirely,
right.
Not entirely,
Right.
but yes.
I would say that hopefully that the Sunday service is tied to the person's lived experience, and hopefully the Sunday service allows them to be better prepared, equipped to face what life, whatever their life has to offer, whatever they have to deal with. And as you have rightly stated, during the pandemic, when Black people could not go to church, that was a major blow in terms of losing that physical connection with people in worship and in conversation, and losing support that they would get on a Sunday morning.
And we also have, over the years in my research, I've got a lot of African Americans who really have strong faith, believe in God, and may not have been to church for a number of years for whatever reason. So yes. Thank you, Robert. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have one more question. So taking a little different tack, is there a theoretical perspective, whether it's a nursing theory or theory borrowed from another discipline, that guides your work?
So I generally use no, there's not a nursing theory that I have used. I've used stress and coping.
Yes. Okay, great.
And Folkman.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I started using that one years ago, and I've looked at other theories throughout the years, and I always go right back to Lazarus and Folkman, stress and coping.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yes.
Michelle has her hand up.
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Hi, I'm coming to you from Canada, from London, Ontario. And I'm a PhD student, and I'm also a registered nurse. And so seeing this topic really excited me. And I guess I really related to your presentation because since COVID and studying here in my office, I have post-its of scriptures on my desk and things like that have been helping me just get through grad school. I'm in my last year. And I'm a younger adult, and I'm wondering, you had mentioned how these older adults have a strong faith. And so I'm wondering how might age affect, or your thoughts about how age might affect how people cope with illness in terms of their level of faithfulness or their spirituality. And also in terms of spirituality, that's one thing I'm studying myself. I'm looking at spiritual health in youth who have bipolar disorder specifically. So my work has been in mental health. And so I'm just curious about age and how you're seeing that tie into how people are coping with illness.
Okay, so let me refer back to another study that I did. And I started out interviewing age 50 and older in the community, African Americans in the community, and how they use a religious song about verse of prayer. So I did that study, and then I had the question of whether or not younger adults, what did they do? Same thing that you're talking about, right? And this was even before the recent Pew Forum came out that said, folks aren't going to church like they used to. So I did repeat the study with age 18 to 49, right? And I think I did a total of 60 interviews, which is incredibly large for a qualitative study. But I wanted to do that because I wanted to make a comparison between the 18 to 29 and then the 30 to 49 group, okay? But I was especially interested in the 18 to 29 because that age group, unlike my generation, they were able to, they're college age, and they're able to decide whether or not they want to go to church or to Sunday school. My age group, you didn't have a choice. So I was really interested in what they were using, particularly given that many of them were away at college and were faced with stressful life situations, maybe for the first time. So let me tell you what I learned, because that's even more exciting. What I learned was that when these young individuals encountered what was stressful for them, what they would say is, when my back was up against the wall and I had no place else to turn, guess where they turned? They turned to the stories of grandmama, what grandmama used, what I learned, what I remember from grandmama. And in comparison to maybe older generations who are not as computer literate, these younger kids were able to remember a part of a song, a part of a Bible verse, but mainly a part of a song, and they could go online and find the song and recall it from there. So that was a pleasant surprise in that finding, is that when the younger generations, when their backs against the wall, even though they may not have been in church at the time, they relied on what they had been exposed to growing up from their parents, mother, father. But man, it was powerful what they learned from what they could remember from spending summers with grandmama or granddaddy. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's amazing. You know, and were these youth also African Americans, or was it
They were
different?
all African Americans.
Okay. Okay.
They are identified as African American. And you know, I'm hopeful that somebody will come along. I did publish a little bit from that data. My passion is with older African Americans, but I need to make it known that that data is available should somebody want to analyze it for whatever reason. But I did do a couple of pubs off of it, but I'm sure there's some other stuff in there.
Well, thank you. Please, if I can access that article, that research, that would be really great and helpful for me. My research is focusing on youth with mental health challenges and spirituality. So looking at spiritual experiences and how youth understand spirituality today and how that relates to their mood. So any information about just youth and spirituality in general is really helpful.
So I did, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I did publish the papers on microaggressions, and I don't think that paper is available readily. But if you send me an email, and I can send you the PDF of that paper. It's on how younger adults use their spirituality in response to microaggressions. You might find that one interesting.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. This is very interesting and inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Caitlin, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Hamilton. It's great to see you again
Hi.
from years back from Dr. Koenig's research workshop, where a lot of your work inspired me back then. And I'm also a registered nurse and PhD student, similar to Michelle. So I'm doing qualitative work and some intervention work for my dissertation. So in the spirit of how I'm interested in how qualitative can inform intervention development. So from your presentation, it appears that online services have been both beneficial, like increasing access to a variety of church services, but also have their limitations, such as the computer access and internet access. So in thinking about church-based interventions for coping for breast cancer survivors or folks going through breast cancer treatment, how do you foresee the future of those interventions evolving? Do you see them being offered online, maybe integrated into church services on Sunday or throughout, like you said, other days of the week? Or do you think in person is still going to be kind of the primary modality for delivery?
So can I answer that based on my own personal experience and what has happened with me? So I had always been looking at church services online, but man, during COVID, I was able to go back to church services in my hometown back in rural Western, North Carolina. Man, that was wonderful. But those churches struggled more with finances to finance, getting things online. I also look at a church service, a large congregation out of Kentucky. And let me tell you what he says. He says that this pandemic has changed the way, and he doesn't see that online services are going to go. And if you remember, some churches had online anyway, even before, but those that didn't, once they adapted that technology, he doesn't think that it's going to go away. He thinks it's going to be the new way of doing things, because he found that he could reach far more people than just face to face, right? So I'm going to say, and Robert can chirp in, I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to be face to face and online for those churches that can afford to do it. Now, some of the churches back home, and I've started sending little checks to some of the churches back home, because I know it's expensive and I know the offerings are down and that kind of thing. So whether or not these churches, in these small rural towns, can continue to afford to financially support this, is probably going to determine whether they will continue to do it. But for those that can, I suspect that they will continue to offer both face-to-face and online. Robert?
Yeah, if I could jump in here. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Online services are not going away. And especially we are finding that members are not returning to in-person service. Some are still afraid of COVID. Those with underlying health conditions, especially are staying home, especially the seniors. But then some folks have just gotten used to watching services in their beds or in their pajamas, or having coffee on their sofa, and they just are not coming back, unfortunately. However, I will say this: those who are coming back are finding a qualitative difference in the in-person experience versus the online experience. And I've had members who have returned to our church say that it's not the same experience. So being in person is just a whole different experience that they are appreciating more, and that they have returned to in person. So yeah. But yeah, I think both will continue, going forward.
If I could just add a little bit to that. So I'm the senior pastor at a medium-sized church up in Massachusetts. And I'm also getting my PhD in nursing at a school up here. And one thing, so this is an argument from the pastoral perspective. We were streaming online before the pandemic for shut-ins and snowbirds and things of that nature. And one of the conversations we're having now is actually taking a break from streaming at some point, once we feel like we are through COVID, whatever that means, now that COVID, is basically endemic. But because we as an embodied. And so while I understand people making the decision to stay home and worship from home, that it is not, as Robert was pointing out, it's not the same experience. And so I think over time, if churches choose to make that their primary model, or they rely on it too heavily, I think what churches are going to find over time is their ability to effectively disciple and shape their members is also going to decline. And we are going to end up with exacerbating generational issues that already exist. That is purely my own personal perspective, but we are definitely having these conversations in the leadership of our church of do we actually do away with streaming that we had been doing prior to coronavirus? Because through coronavirus, now the way it's being utilized is actually not productive for, in a long-term way, for what we would like to see in our congregation. So that's a challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, I would just say this, that, our concern is losing members. So if we stop streaming, will they go some other place or look at some other worship experience, et cetera, et cetera. I have found that on our Tuesday night Bible study, which is streamed, we have more people now than we had in person. And the same is true for our Friday night prayer service. We have more folks online than we had in person.
Matthew, let me just say this to you. If you send me an email, I'll send you one of my old proposals to show you how I wrote up stress and coping theory in a research proposal. But send me, and I'm happy to share that with you to show you how I wrote that section up in a NIH funded grant.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, Sandy, I hope you can hear me. I have a cold. I don't have COVID. So this has been a really wonderful presentation. It's the first time I've been able to join one of these. So I work for the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute. And as you probably, a lot of you have heard, there's a huge concern that we have on what the impact of COVID on cancer incidence, cancer outcome for a wide variety of reasons. Dr. Hamilton, I really admire the work you're doing. It's wonderful and so challenging. And to you, Caitlin and Michelle, both keep pressing on, girls. So, it's so challenging, but such opportunities for gaining more wisdom and understanding here. So one of the things, that Ned Sharpless, Dr. Ned Sharpless, our director at the National Cancer Institute, has been quoted as saying, that they anticipate seeing a big spike in cancer incidence as a result of the COVID pandemic. But given the impact that having a strong faith system and having God to turn to during times of illness, during times of stress, during times of pandemics, the impact that has on human health may actually rise to the surface, particularly as a result of COVID, and maybe, just maybe, we'll be very pleasantly surprised to see that there has been a great impact. Maybe what we'll see, I like to look for the blessings as a result of COVID. And I like to, and there have been many. And one of them is, I'm wondering if, our faith, people that are believers, people have come to believe during this time. People have strengthened their relationship with God during this time. And those could be all very positive outcomes, and they could manifest themselves in different ways. And one of them being, because I'm a cancer researcher, one of them could be as maybe we won't see it as detrimental of an impact on cancer as it's being predicted. So thank you. I think it's wonderful that all of us can meet like this and listen to such a wonderful presentation. So it's a wonderful group. Thanks.
There is one question here in the chat. Interesting that some individuals equated being obedient to the CDC as being obedient to God. How prevalent was that thought process in the group overall?
So if I could answer from the women, if in this group, I'm going to speak for them, and I would say that once they started getting the information that they needed to get to be safe, they would probably say that's God, that message was communicated to them from God. So God put these educated people here, God put the scientists here, and they're giving us this advice so that we can stay healthy. And therefore, we're going to be obedient to that. That's what, and I'm going to speak for these women and say that.
Very good.
Yeah, I think if I could just add, I think especially for older Black women who are Christians, there is this training, or they've been socialized to accept authority. And so, I mean, so your doctor is a medical authority, and you're trained to obey authority. If that makes sense. Jill, would you say
Well,
that?
but yeah, but that authority is yes, but it's God has provided this for us. So you are the doctors. They were provided by God. So through them, God is taking care of them. Yes. Yes.
If anyone wants to email Jill, just send me an email. I'm happy to send you her email address. So I know there was a question in the chat about that. So just send me an email. I'll send it to you. And
I was going to say, please email me. I have my smartphone. My students taught me how to use it, and I respond fairly quickly. I'd love to hear from you.
any last questions? It's 1 o'clock. So any last questions before we close today? Sandy's got her hand up.
No, I meant to clap. That was a clap.
Okay.
Sorry
Well,
about that.
we're all
Clap.
Thank you all. This was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it.
thanks.
I'm sorry. Yes, Harold, I don't have your email address to ask for Jill's address. So could you provide that maybe in the chat, please?
So I am J, B as in boy, Hamil. J, B as in boy, Hamil at Emory, EMORY.edu.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank
Jill.
you. Thank you, Harold.
Wonderful presentation, as you can, and great questions. So what an incredible discussion. So
Wasn't
we'll
it
have,
good? Yes.
we'll have this